Consider supporting Archaeosoup on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. Link available in the video description. Hello and welcome back to Book Review. Not only is this a series where I review books, but also it's a place where I present overviews of books, literary analysis, and readings of riddles, poems, and stories that I want to share with you and bring to your attention. And I feel compelled at the moment, during these strange plague days of 2020, to share with you stories that are very close to my heart, stories that I grew up with in North Wales, and that kind of inform how people see the landscape even today in North Wales in a way which isn't quite the same anywhere else in the UK, certainly. I feel so lucky, blessed even, to have grown up in a place and amongst people who view their histories and the landscape through tales that are told and shared, even with little threads missing. You know, the oral tradition obviously is imbued and embellished with the telling, but which means that when you go to a new place, someone will say, "See that mountain there? That is the mountain that King Arthur jumped off on his mighty steed, and you can still see the hoof prints in the stone where the horse leapt into the air." It's exciting, and it made me appreciate from a very early age the value of place, and that definitely informed my career as an archaeologist, without a doubt, without any doubt at all. And these tales, they have their written origins in the sort of the 12th, 13th century. In fact, there are four main ancient texts, books of Wales, and I've actually made some notes here so I don't forget them. We have the Black Book of Carmarthen, that was written down in the mid 13th century, the Book of Taliesin, the Book of Aneurin, and the Red Book of Hergest as well, and of course, along with those four books, the famous Mabinogion, as written lifeboats for stories that may well even have their roots back in the Bronze Age of Wales. So we're talking about ancient tales that I not only held dear as a child, but continue to cherish today. And we're going to start some of these tales with one that's particularly relevant to Archaeosoup, in so much as this story is almost certainly connected with the archaeological remains that are periodically uncovered in Cardigan Bay. Sometimes a storm will reveal these remains, and I'll talk a little bit about that after we've read the story. Today's story comes specifically from Welsh Legends and Myths by Graham Watkins, and he collected together 80 different stories, some of which from those ancient sources, some of which from later sort of stories about the drovers of Wales and the origins of banks and agriculture, this kind of thing, linked with that trade. So wonderful collection of stories from various times. I recommend it. But today we're going to talk about, or we're going to hear the story of the lost land of Wales. King Gwyddno Garanhir ruled a wealthy kingdom called Cantref y Gwaelod, in an area we know today as Cardigan Bay. The bottom hundredth, as the kingdom was known, was so rich and fertile that the grain stores were always full and the people of the kingdom were content. The king's palace was on a hill, surrounded by villages and farms. He spent his days hunting in the great forest while people tilled the land. A great dam with two giant gates protected this fine land. The guardian of the dam was a prince named Seithennin. Seithennin was the seventh son of the king, and proud of the great responsibility given to him. As the youngest son, he had no wealth, but the job gave him status and the people respected him. Within the gates were giant sluices, and each day, when the tide was low, Seithennin would turn the huge wheels that opened the sluices to let water from the bottom hundredth escape into the sea. Before the sea returned, he would close the sluices, keeping the land safe. As the years passed, Seithennin grew bored of his job. He began to neglect the dam. Seithennin no longer walked the dam each morning, checking for cracks. He stopped spending the afternoons putting grease on the gears that opened the sluice, or painting pitch on the gates to protect them from the salt water. Instead of doing his duty, Seithennin would pass each morning drinking wine as he waited for the tide to turn. Each day after his midday meal, Seithennin would sleep for a while, and then he would drink more wine. He did not see the hinges on the gates growing rusty, or notice the gears that had turned the sluices slowly stiffen with age. One day, a great prince arrived in the kingdom, and King Gwyddno decreed that there would be feasting in his honour. Musicians collected from across the land. Fine beers and wines were brewed for the occasion. Beasts were slaughtered and roasted, and huge fish were prepared for the banquet. Sweet dishes were laid out by the hundred, ready for the feast, and everyone in the kingdom was invited to the palace. Seithennin, dressed in his finest clothes, mounted his horse and rode to the palace. King Gwyddno greeted Seithennin. "This is Seithennin, the guardian of the dam," said the king to his noble visitor. "Tell us, Seithennin, are the gates closed?" asked the king. "They are, sire, but the tide is out, so the sluices are open," replied Seithennin. "When will you shut them?" asked the noble visitor. "I shall shut the sluices at midnight before the tide turns," said Seithennin. "Leave early, Seithennin. It's a long ride from the palace to the dam," said the king, and turned to greet the other guests. The feast started and musicians played loudly as people ate. The wine flowed and the feast was devoured, and the clock tower struck 9. "Seithennin, the gates, you should go," said a reveller. "Nonsense, it's still early," answered Seithennin, and reached for another flagon of wine. The king and his guests danced and laughed, and the party grew louder. The clock tower struck 10. "Seithennin, the gates, there isn't much time," yelled King Gwyddno above the noise. "I told you, don't worry. My horse can fly like the wind. There's plenty of time," replied Seithennin, and drank greedily. Seithennin's cheeks were red with wine, his laughter loud and raucous, when the clock struck 11. "That's enough. You are going now. This is a royal command," snapped the king. Seithennin got to his feet, staggered from the palace, mounted his horse, and rode away. The wind had started to blow from the west. The rain lashed his face, and it was a fearful night. Thunder crashed between the clouds and lightning flashed across the sky. The torrent quickly turned the track to mire, and the horse slowed, sinking into the slimy mud. Suddenly the horse missed its footing and slid into the ditch, and Seithennin landed in the mud. Groggily he stood up and began to run towards the dam. He knew that he had to get to the gates before the tide turned. His feet slid in the mud. Brambles tore at his mud-covered clothes. The harsh weather had sobered the prince somewhat, and he forced himself forwards. The sky cleared for a moment, and the moon broke through, and there in front of Seithennin were the gates. As he staggered forward, the sea, whipped up by the wind, broke through the sluices, and force of the rushing water breached the rotten gates and smashed the rusty hinges. The sea flooded in, and the water carried Seithennin away, and he was never seen again. King Gwyddno and a few of his followers managed to escape and lived the rest of their lives in poverty. But the land of Cantref y Gwaelod vanished beneath the waves. The so-called bottom hundredth was lost forever. If you listen carefully, sometimes you can still hear the bells from the ancient clock tower, ringing mournfully from the bottom of the sea. I love that story, and I found it so evocative as a child, and even more so when I realised that there was a kernel of physical evidence for this lost kingdom, which every now and then is revealed when there's a storm in Cardigan Bay. And indeed, as the storm in the story is so important, the storm reveals what was seemingly an ancient forest, possibly from the Bronze Age. So this is a segment or a little cutout from The Guardian in February 2014. The forest of Borth once stretched for miles on boggy land between Borth and Anislas, before climate change and rising sea levels buried it under layers of peat, sand and salt water. Scientists have identified pine, alder, oak and birch amongst the stumps which are occasionally exposed in very stormy winters, such as in 2010, when a stretch of tree remains was revealed conveniently opposite a visitor centre. The skeletal trees are said to have given rise to the local legend of the lost kingdom of Cantref y Gwaelod, drowned beneath the waves. The trees stopped growing between 4,500 and 6,000 years ago as the water level rose and a thick blanket of peat formed. This year, a great swathe of the lost forest has been revealed, and indeed I think it was revealed again more recently as well, after a storm. And last month, archaeologists also found a timber walkway nearby exposed by the storms. It was discovered by Ross Cook and Deanna Groom from the Royal Commission of Ancient and Historical Monuments of Wales, who went beach walking in the wake of the storms to check for any new finds. This was, you can see why this was so, again, growing up, hearing about this sort of stuff was so informative. It was made from short lengths of coppiced branches held in place with upright posts, and it's been dated to between 3,100 and 4,000 years old, built as local people found ways to cope with living in an increasingly waterlogged environment. 2 years ago, human and animal footprints were found preserved in the hardened top layer of peat, along with scatterings of burnt stones from ancient hearths. So this story has clearly mythical roots in the idea of a clock tower, but even I suppose in the 13th century would have been an elaborate indication of the wealth, supposedly, of this lost kingdom. But the idea that actually people have been seeing these trees for thousands of years and coming up with this story is delightful and is attached to this archaeological evidence. I love it. And indeed, I love the fact that these stories are communal property in that sense. In fact, one of my favourite sources for these stories that I'm going to be reading to you from is North Wales Folk Tales for Children by Fiona Collins. And at the back of this book, she says beautifully, the stories in this book are all part of the oral tradition, which means many different people have been telling them, and I certainly heard these in many different variations from different people as a child. For a long time, these stories have been passed down, and they don't belong to one person in the way that an authored story does. They can be heard from many storytellers as well as found in many books. And I think that's beautiful. I think it's wonderful that story and a story history and a storied landscape exists in North Wales, and I'm very pleased to be sharing with you these tales that inspired me as a child. And so, actually, on the one hand, I would recommend that book, the 80 Tales on Kindle, but also actually this book here, much more obviously aimed at children, is also a great resource because I don't think actually I'm reminded of my geography teacher in high school when I remember we were doing GCSEs, and he pulls out this book from year 7, first year high school, this book, and he goes, "Here you go, everyone open this book, open it to page 20." And people are like, "Oh, but sir, this is like a first year book," and he goes, it's not the book that matters, it's the resource inside. If the map is good, use that map. And in that sense, the way that these stories are told in this book are expertly crafted. They use the rhythms and the techniques of the oral tradition, repetition, this kind of thing, in a way that brings them to life. And so if you find a version of these tales that's evocative for you, that's the right version, you know. So between them, these two books rather, I'm going to be sharing stories from my youth, of certainly stories that I heard as a child, and that hopefully will have little tidbits that I can add on the end in terms of geography, history, and archaeology. If you've enjoyed this, please do let me know below, and as ever, until next time, do take care. Bye bye.